Hannah Porter had never held a gentleman in her arms before, and certainly not one crying on the wet stones behind a Boston church. She did not know his name when she knelt beside him, only that his bride had vanished and that he could barely breathe. When Nathaniel Mercer finally released her sleeve, he looked at her with an embarrassment she refused to encourage. Then he asked, quietly, "You fitted Clara's gown for months. Was she happy?" Hannah's heart tightened. He told her she did not have to answer. That permission made the question harder, because Hannah knew the truth could cost her everything. What would happen between them if she trusted him with it? Earlier that morning, Hannah had been in the vestry of St. T, Paul's fastening the last hooks of Clara Whitmore's wedding gown, while Clara's mother complained that the waist sat badly. Hannah knew the waist had been fitted exactly as requested, just as she knew Clara herself had changed during the months since March. Her shoulders had grown sharper beneath the fabric, her hands seemed cold even in warm rooms, and each new set of measurements showed a little less of her than the one before. During one fitting, Clara had stood before the mirror with her lips parted as though she had gathered enough courage to say something important. Hannah had seen the moment coming and deliberately lowered her eyes, claiming that the hem needed attention when it did not. A dressmaker's assistant survived by noticing everything and repeating nothing, and Hannah's widowed mother depended on every dollar she brought home. On June 4, when the church filled with the confused murmur of guests, realizing that the bride would not appear, Hannah slipped through the side door with her work bag and entered the narrow service court. She found a man sitting against the wall with his hat several feet away, one hand covering his face, while his shoulders shook so violently that his breathing had become ragged. Hannah hesitated only long enough to understand that no one else was coming to him. She knelt on the rain-darkened stones, put her arms around his shoulders, and allowed him to grip her sleeve until the worst of the sobbing had passed. She did not speak because pity would have humiliated him, while silence allowed him to decide when he was ready to let go. When he finally released her, he apologized for making a spectacle of himself. Hannah answered that being hurt was not shameful, and when she tried to dismiss herself as only a dressmaker's girl, he looked at her with red-rimmed eyes and said, "You are somebody." The words unsettled her more than his tears had. Wealthy families often spoke freely while Hannah knelt at their hems because they forgot that a working woman possessed ears, memory, and judgment. When he asked her name, she gave it, and when he replied, "Nathaniel Mercer," she recognized the head of Mercer Shipping, whose vessels, warehouses, and business dealings were regularly mentioned in Boston newspapers. Embarrassment rushed through her as she remembered how freely she had held him, yet when she began to apologize, Nathaniel stopped her without touching her. "Please, don't apologize for kindness," he said, and there was no suggestion that her compassion had created a debt between them. If stories about people divided by money and position interest you, stay with Hannah here, because this is the moment when silence stops protecting anyone. If you enjoy romances built on respect rather than rescue, consider subscribing and follow what their next choices cost them. Nathaniel then asked about Clara, but before Hannah answered, he told her plainly that she could refuse and that he would not think worse of her for protecting her livelihood. Hannah thought of her mother, Mrs. Hale's shop on Tremont Street, and the 4 other young women whose wages depended on families like the Whitmores. Then she remembered Clara's face in the mirror, and the sentence Hannah had deliberately prevented her from finishing. "No, she was not happy," Hannah said, and when Nathaniel's expression tightened, she continued before fear could close her mouth again. Clara had lost weight, stopped looking at herself in the glass, and sometimes gone entirely rigid when a particular man entered the room or was mentioned. Nathaniel asked how Hannah had noticed so much, and she told him that noticing was her work, even if nobody thought to ask what a dressmaker's assistant had seen. Then she confessed the part that shamed her most. Clara had once tried to speak. Hannah had understood that she was trying, and she had invented a problem with the hem because hearing the truth might have forced her to act at the risk of her mother's only income. Nathaniel neither excused nor condemned her. He listened until Hannah understood that he was treating her judgment as something worth hearing rather than gossip from a servant. At last, he asked whether she knew why Clara had run, and Hannah said she knew who had frightened her. When Nathaniel quietly asked, "Was it me?" Hannah met his eyes and told him it was not. The humiliation in his face gave way to fear as he waited, and Hannah, knowing the words could never be taken back, said, "Her brother, Edward Whitmore." In that instant, they ceased to be merely a wealthy bridegroom abandoned at the altar and a working woman who had comforted him. They became two people holding the same dangerous truth, and both chose to remain there long enough to hear what it meant. By Friday afternoon, 2 days after the failed wedding, Hannah understood that the danger was no longer simply what she had said behind St. Paul's, but who had chosen to repeat it. Mrs. Hale closed the Tremont Street workroom door, placed a folded note on the cutting table, and asked whether Hannah had been seen holding Nathaniel Mercer in the church service court and speaking to him about Clara Whitmore. Hannah could have softened the truth, but she had already learned what silence cost. "Yes, ma'am, I was," she answered, because pretending otherwise would only make kindness and honesty look shameful. Mrs. Hale's expression tightened with the practical fear of a woman responsible for rent, suppliers, and 4 young workers whose pay depended on wealthy clients returning season after season. The Whitmores and their relatives had brought gowns to Tremont Street for years, so Hannah understood the risk clearly enough to offer her resignation if dismissing her would protect everyone else. Mrs. Hale fixed her with a hard look and said, "Do not offer me your livelihood when I asked for facts." Beneath the sharpness, Hannah heard fear rather than anger, and that distinction allowed her to tell the whole of what she could defend. She described Clara's shrinking measurements, her refusal to look at herself in the mirror, and the way her body became rigid whenever Edward Whitmore entered a fitting room or his name arose in conversation. Hannah also confessed that Clara had once seemed ready to speak, and that Hannah, frightened of what hearing the words might require, had bent over an imaginary problem with the hem instead. Mrs. Hale listened without interruption, then crossed to a tall cabinet and unlocked a compartment Hannah had never seen open. Inside were decades of fitting ledgers, their covers worn smooth by years of hands, and their pages filled with measurements, alterations, delays, interruptions, and notes about whatever had changed the course of a fitting. "We do not write what we imagine," Mrs. Hale told her. "We write what happened. A woman may say nothing, but the fitting changes when she cannot stand still, when someone enters, or when the numbers stop making sense." Hannah thought immediately of her own ledger, where 11 fittings for Clara appeared in the same plain handwriting she had used for hundreds of ordinary appointments. She fetched the book from her work drawer and held it against her apron. Nathaniel Mercer's name, money, and influence might offer protection if she carried the ledger to him, yet doing so would also make it seem as though the record belonged to his grievance rather than her work. Hannah therefore placed the book in Mrs. Hale's hands. "It should stay here," she said. "It was made here." Mrs. Hale locked it beside the older ledgers, and Hannah felt steadier when the key turned, because, for once, keeping something safe did not require giving it to the most powerful person available. On June 9, Nathaniel came to Tremont Street and asked to speak with Hannah. She met him in the receiving room with formal posture and folded hands, needing to know whether the intimacy of one terrible morning had created an obligation he believed he could claim. He looked composed again, although the strain around his eyes remained, and he began by telling her that Clara had written. She was safe in Newport. Hannah did not ask to read the letter, and Nathaniel did not offer it. He explained only what concerned him. Clara had not fled because she hated him. She had intended to marry him as a way out of her family home, then found that she could not bear to use another person as an escape. "I am glad she is safe," Hannah said, and Nathaniel answered that he was glad too, without speaking of Clara as though her choice had been an offense committed against him. Then he admitted that he had considered whether appearing at the shop might worsen Hannah's position. "If my coming here harms you, tell me, and I will not come again," he said. Hannah studied him before asking whether he truly meant that he would stay away if she requested it. "Yes," he answered. "I would rather lose the right to speak with you than make your situation harder." Hannah had expected instructions or protection from a man accustomed to solving difficulties with money, yet he was asking her where the boundary stood. "I do not know yet what I will need," she said, "but I need you not to decide it for me." Nathaniel accepted that without argument, and something in Hannah's understanding of him shifted. The gulf between their positions remained enormous, but she could now imagine that he might possess power without assuming a right to use it over her. His expression changed when he explained why he had come. Mrs. Whitmore had begun circulating a version of the failed wedding in which Clara had been content until someone connected with the dressmaking rooms filled her head with alarming suggestions and then attached herself to the abandoned Bridegroom. Hannah felt the accusation before Nathaniel finished, because there was only one working woman known to have spoken privately with him that morning. He did not promise to make the danger disappear or tell her that his name would protect her. Instead, he said quietly, "They have decided you are easier to blame than their own family." For a moment, Hannah heard only the muffled movement of scissors and fabric beyond the door, the ordinary labor of 4 women whose wages could be damaged by her name. Nathaniel waited rather than telling her what to do, and Hannah chose not to ask him for rescue. Behind the wall, locked in Mrs. Hale's cabinet, 11 entries in Hannah's own hand waited for someone to ask what they actually said. The fitting ledger sat on Mrs. Hale's table between Hannah and Nathaniel, small enough to fit beneath one hand and heavy enough to change the course of every conversation around it. On June 11, Samuel Barrett, Nathaniel's attorney, joined them in the back room at Tremont Street, and Hannah understood that showing the book was not the same as surrendering control of it. 2 days earlier, Nathaniel had told her that Mrs. Whitmore's attorneys were preparing to blame a dressmaker's assistant for Clara's disappearance, yet he had not promised to silence them with influence he could never make neutral. Instead, he had acknowledged the ugly imbalance directly. "They have standing, family, and money," he had told Hannah. "You have the truth, but Boston will not necessarily value both equally." Hannah had answered, by asking him not to act for 2 weeks. "Do what you did behind the church," she said. "Ask me what I know, and let me answer before anyone decides what ought to be done with it." Nathaniel agreed, and that promise shaped the meeting now before them. Barrett examined the closed ledger without touching it until Mrs. Hale gave permission. "I want to be clear, Miss Porter," he said. "A fitting book does not prove what anyone intended or felt." Hannah appreciated the warning because she had no wish to turn observation into accusation. "It proves what I measured and what interrupted the work," she replied. "Nothing more." Mrs. Hale nodded, and Nathaniel remained silent while Hannah opened to the first entry from March. She read Clara's measurements, requested alterations, and the ordinary details of sleeves, bodice, lining, and hem. The next appointments showed the numbers changing gradually, but Hannah refused to describe Clara as terrified, abused, or desperate when she had not written those words at the time. Instead, she read exactly what appeared on the pages. Clara would not look in the mirror. She could not stand still. The room was cold when she blamed the heat. Edward entered and Clara stopped moving. Edward's name was mentioned, and Clara lifted a hand toward her collarbone. Barrett interrupted occasionally to ask why a particular note had been made, and Hannah answered each question without embellishment. When he asked why she had recorded Edward entering a room, she explained that the fitting had stopped when he came in. "I record interruptions because otherwise the measurements may not make sense at the next appointment," she said. Barrett asked whether that was her usual practice, and Mrs. Hale crossed to the cabinet containing the older books. "Visitors, children, illness, torn hems, dogs underfoot, sudden calls downstairs," she said. "Anything that changes the fitting goes into the record, because otherwise the next woman with a tape measure has no idea what happened." Barrett's skepticism did not vanish, but it became more careful. Hannah continued through April and May while Nathaniel sat opposite her, with both hands resting on his knees. She expected him to interrupt when the entries made clear how much of Clara's distress had been visible to someone he had scarcely noticed, but he never turned the record into a defense of himself. When Hannah read that Clara had stopped looking at her own reflection, pain tightened Nathaniel's face, yet he allowed the silence afterward to belong to Clara rather than to his wounded pride. That restraint mattered because the ledger did not flatter him. It showed that he had been preparing to marry a woman whose fear had been visible in small practical details while remaining invisible to him. When Hannah reached the final appointment and read Clara's reduced measurements, Barrett leaned forward and asked for the difference from March. Hannah gave him the exact figures, then explained that she had let the waist out at the final fitting because Clara would not have been comfortable otherwise. "Without being asked?" Barrett said. Hannah confirmed it, and Mrs. Hale added that every entry had been written in order during ordinary business, long before anyone knew there would be a scandal. Barrett studied the pages for several moments. "The consistency matters," he said at last. Nathaniel asked whether it mattered enough to stop the Whitmores, and Barrett answered with equal care. "It matters enough that anyone calling Miss Porter a woman who invented a story after June 4th will have a much harder task than they expect." Hannah closed the ledger without triumph. She felt relief instead, because Nathaniel had allowed her work to speak before trying to speak for her. When their eyes met, his expression held respect without pity, and Hannah realized she no longer saw him merely as a powerful man whose choices might endanger her. He had listened because she asked him to, and she had trusted him enough to show him the discipline behind her judgment. Nathaniel, for his part, asked Hannah what she believed should happen next, rather than turning immediately to Barrett. Before she could answer, footsteps sounded in the front room, followed by the scrape of the outer door. Mrs. Hale returned, carrying a folded notice from the landlord, and the color left her face as she read the first lines. She placed the paper beside Clara's ledger, where Hannah could see the words concerning the Tremont Street lease. Mrs. Hale read the landlord's notice twice before setting it beside Clara's fitting ledger, and Hannah understood that Edward had found a way to attack the shop without ever laying a hand on the book. The letter did not name him, yet Samuel Barrett's expression hardened as he examined the clause, allowing the Tremont Street lease to be terminated if the business was deemed injurious to the property's reputation. Nathaniel rose before Barrett finished explaining the practical consequences. "Then I will buy the lease," he said, with the instinctive certainty of a man accustomed to meeting a threat with resources. Mrs. Hale looked directly at him and answered, "No, Mr. Mercer, you will not." Nathaniel's surprise lasted only a moment, but Hannah saw how much effort it cost him not to respond too quickly. Mrs. Hale explained that if Mercer Money owned the rooms, every fitting ledger inside them could be dismissed as something controlled by a wealthy man with a personal grievance against the Whitmores. The records would no longer appear to be ordinary books kept by dressmakers over years of routine work. Opponents could claim that they had become instruments of Nathaniel's quarrel. Hannah understood exactly what refusal might cost. Losing Tremont Street could mean losing clients, wages, and the work that supported her mother. Yet she still said, "Mrs. Hale is right." Nathaniel turned toward her, and for an uncomfortable instant, Hannah became acutely aware of how easily he could have ignored them both. He had the money to purchase the lease, the standing to pressure a landlord, and enough influence to make men reconsider decisions they had thought final. Instead, he asked, "If I do nothing, you may lose the shop. You understand that?" Hannah told him she did. "But if you save it by owning the ground beneath us, Edward can say the book belongs to your anger instead of our work." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, although his voice remained controlled. "I dislike a choice in which helping you damages you," Mrs. Hale replied, that disliking the choice did not change it, and Nathaniel released a breath that was almost a humorless laugh. "No, ma'am. Apparently it does not." Then he sat down again. That simple movement affected Hannah more strongly than any promise of rescue could have done. She had known generous men who considered a gift generous only when the recipient accepted its terms, and powerful men who called resistance ingratitude. Nathaniel had offered the easiest solution available to him, been told no by 2 working women, and allowed the answer to stand. When he looked toward Hannah again, she saw no wounded pride, only frustration directed at a problem he could not purchase away. The feeling that rose in her was no longer gratitude for the morning behind St. Paul's, or relief that he believed her. It was attraction, quiet but unmistakable, and Hannah distrusted it precisely because it had grown out of conduct rather than fantasy. Nathaniel seemed to be studying her as carefully as she studied him. "You would truly rather risk losing these rooms than let me buy them?" he asked. Hannah answered that she would if the alternative was losing ownership of what their work meant. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. "Then I will not ask again. Barrett drew the notice closer and began discussing lawful ways to challenge the landlord without attaching Nathaniel's name to the business. Over the meetings that followed, Hannah found herself listening for Nathaniel's questions as closely as she listened for Barrett's answers. Nathaniel still tended to begin with the strongest solution available to him, but he had learned to revise it when Hannah or Mrs. Hale explained what his position prevented him from seeing. More important, he began asking Hannah what she thought before offering his own opinion. Their conversations remained centered on Clara, the ledgers, and the threatened business, yet the distance between Hannah and Nathaniel changed because each had begun to value the other's mind as much as the help the other could provide. Hannah guarded that change with care. Whatever she felt for Nathaniel could not become another reason to turn Clara's fear into a story about someone else. Late on July 6th, after the workrooms had emptied, Hannah opened Clara's ledger again and forced herself to read only what had been written before anyone knew there would be a failed wedding. The first fitting stopped her. Clara had asked for a sleeve 3 inches shorter than the original pattern and had asked twice. Hannah stared at the line, remembering that such a sleeve could be worn with a long fitted mitt, allowing the arm to remain covered without requiring the sleeve itself to be handled again during later fittings. Then she noticed the absence surrounding that choice. Across 11 appointments, she had recorded Clara's waist, shoulders, bodice, and underarm measurements. But after that first decision, Hannah had never measured Clara's bare arm again. She did not carry the discovery to Nathaniel, despite knowing he would listen. Instead, preserving the boundary between attraction and responsibility, she closed the ledger and resolved to show Mrs. Hale first thing in the morning. Before extinguishing the lamp, Hannah read the line once more. Sleeve 3 inches shorter than pattern. Asked twice. The next morning, Mrs. Hale held Clara's ledger beneath the window light while Hannah showed her the sleeve entry, and neither woman hurried to decide what it meant. The line was ordinary in isolation, but its timing was not. Months before the wedding, Clara had insisted on a sleeve that could be worn with a long mitt and would allow her arms to remain covered through the summer without inviting repeated measurements during fittings. Mrs. Hale read the words again before saying, "It suggests a question, Hannah. It does not give us the answer." By the time Samuel Barrett and Nathaniel arrived, Hannah had repeated that distinction often enough to understand that it mattered as much as the discovery itself. Barrett examined the entry, compared it with the later measurements, and warned them that the absence of arm measurements was not proof of injury, fear, or wrongdoing. "You have found a question," he told Hannah, "and finding it does not give any of us permission to answer it for Miss Whitmore." Nathaniel stood near the window, his expression taut with the effort of restraint. Hannah could see how badly he wanted certainty, not merely because Clara had left him at the altar, but because every new detail revealed how little of her private life he had understood. "If there is an explanation," he asked Barrett, "who is entitled to ask for it?" Barrett answered that Clara alone was entitled to decide whether there was an explanation she wished to give and to whom she wished to give it. Nathaniel lowered his eyes to the ledger, and Hannah waited for the old instinct to solve the problem to reappear. He had money, attorneys, social standing, and enough practical power to make inquiries that Clara might never be able to escape. After a long pause, however, he said, "Then we do not force an answer from her." Something eased inside Hannah because this boundary stood directly between Nathaniel and knowledge he desperately wanted. His willingness to accept it made her trust him more deeply than any promise of protection could have done. That afternoon, Hannah sat at Mrs. Hale's writing desk with a clean sheet of paper and composed a letter to Clara in Newport. After several attempts, she settled on language that gave Clara control rather than inviting confession. Hannah wrote that the fitting ledger contained entries concerning her, that Hannah would bring the book if Clara wished to see it, and that if Clara preferred it destroyed without being discussed, Hannah would honor that choice as well. She described none of the sleeve detail, named no suspicion, and made no request for accusation, explanation, or legal action. When Nathaniel saw the addressed envelope, he asked whether Hannah intended to travel if Clara requested the book. Hannah told him she did. "Then I can arrange the fare," he said, his instinct to remove a practical difficulty appearing before he could reconsider it. Hannah declined, and explained that she had savings enough for the journey. Nathaniel looked ready to argue, then stopped himself. "Of course," he said. "You have already decided how you mean to manage it." The correction was small enough that anyone else might have missed it, but Hannah felt its significance. He had begun with the assumption that help meant providing and ended by recognizing that she had already chosen for herself. "If Clara asks me to come alone, I will do that too," Hannah added. Nathaniel met her eyes and answered, "Then I will not ask to accompany you, and I will not make you carry my questions." He did not request a report for afterward, and Hannah noticed that restraint more sharply than she wanted to. During the days that followed, Clara's silence became a quiet presence between them. Hannah had grown accustomed to Nathaniel listening before speaking, and to the care with which he separated what he wanted from what he believed he had a right to demand. That familiarity made the possibility of leaving for Newport unexpectedly difficult, but Hannah knew the journey, if Clara requested it, belonged to Clara before it belonged to anything developing between herself and Nathaniel. Once before, she had lowered her head rather than allow Clara to speak. She would not repeat that failure simply because she had begun to care for the man Clara had almost married. When the reply finally arrived, Mrs. Hale placed the sealed envelope directly in Hannah's hands. Nathaniel and Barrett were present, but neither moved closer as Hannah recognized Clara's handwriting and broke the seal. The message was brief enough to take in at once. "Bring it. Come alone." Hannah folded the paper carefully and said she would leave for Newport with the ledger. Nathaniel's expression changed, revealing concern and something more personal that he did not name, but he merely said, "Then I hope the journey gives Clara whatever she needs from it." Hannah searched his face for a claim hidden inside the sentence and found none. The following morning, she placed the fitting ledger inside her work bag, tucked Clara's letter beside it, and counted out the fare from her own savings. Nathaniel did not appear at the departure to supervise or protect her, because she had not asked him to be there. Hannah left Boston alone, and for the first time, the deliberate distance between them felt less like separation than proof that trust could survive without possession. Clara Whitmore did not reach for the fitting ledger when Hannah placed it on the table between them in Newport. She looked at the closed book for several long moments, then asked Hannah to read it aloud, because weeks away from Boston had left her doubting whether some of what she remembered had happened as she remembered it. Hannah opened to the first March fitting and read exactly what she had written at the time, without interpretation and without turning hindsight into certainty. She gave Clara the measurements, alterations, interruptions, and repeated details that had seemed ordinary when recorded separately. Clara listened, while the entries showed her steady loss of weight and the occasions when Edward's presence or name changed the course of a fitting. When Hannah finished, Clara kept both hands folded in her lap and said, "So I did not imagine all of it." Hannah answered with the same discipline she had used before Barrett. "I can only tell you what I saw, but what I saw is written there, and it was written before the wedding." Clara then asked why the book contained no arm measurements after the first fitting. Hannah explained the shorter sleeve request, and admitted that she had not understood its possible significance until July. She added that she would not ask Clara to explain it because the book concerned Clara's history, not Hannah's curiosity. For a long moment, Clara remained motionless. Then, entirely by her own choice and without prompting, she pulled one sleeve upward and showed Hannah injuries connected to harm that had begun when she was 15. Hannah did not reach for the ledger, ask for dates, or treat what she saw as evidence that now belonged to her. She stayed where she was until Clara lowered the sleeve again, and when Clara chose to speak, Hannah listened in the way she wished she had listened months earlier in the fitting room. They talked privately for hours, but Hannah wrote down none of it. By the end of the conversation, Clara had made two conditions unmistakably clear. The ledger was to be secured, and was not to be used in any prosecution, legal proceeding, or public accusation without her permission, and nothing she had told Hannah in Newport was to be repeated to Nathaniel, Mrs. Hale, Barrett, or anyone else. Hannah accepted both conditions without bargaining because repairing her earlier silence did not give her the right to take control of Clara's voice now. When she returned to Boston, she found the Tremont Street business still weakening under lost clients and the threatened lease. Nathaniel came to the shop, and Hannah met him in the same receiving room where he had once promised not to decide what she needed. He searched her face before asking only, "Is Clara safe?" Hannah told him she was, then added, "She has made her own decision about the ledger and about what happens next." Questions tightened Nathaniel's expression, but Hannah continued before he could ask them. "I gave her my word that what she told me would remain with me. That includes you." She expected the sentence to hurt because Clara's disappearance had opened a wound in Nathaniel's life that still had no complete explanation. Nathaniel looked toward the window, gathered himself, and finally said, "Then I will not ask you to break your word." Hannah studied him, almost suspicious of the relief his answer created. "You may never know what she told me," she said. Nathaniel answered that he understood. "And the book may never be used the way you once hoped." He nodded slowly. "It is hers before it is useful to me." The words altered something between them that Hannah could no longer pretend was merely professional. She had trusted Nathaniel before when he accepted refusals involving money or reputation, but this was different. He was accepting a boundary that denied him knowledge about the woman who had left him at the altar, and he did so without resentment toward Hannah for keeping it. In that moment, Hannah knew she could trust him with a no, even when he did not understand what stood behind it. Nathaniel did not declare what he felt, yet the way he looked at her had changed as well. His gratitude for the woman who had comforted him behind St. Paul's had become something quieter and more enduring, grounded in admiration for the judgment she exercised, even when it cost her. Hannah felt the same dangerous closeness and refused to use it as an escape. The Tremont Street rooms were still under threat. Clients were disappearing, and the livelihoods inside those walls were becoming less secure by the week. If she ever chose Nathaniel, she wanted that choice to come from freedom rather than from a need for rescue. Neither of them spoke of love that afternoon, but neither could return to calling what stood between them gratitude. Before Nathaniel left, Hannah said, "I may need Barrett's advice about the business, but I do not need you to save it for me." Nathaniel answered, "Then advice is all I will offer unless you ask for something else." Hannah nodded, and together they walked to the workroom door, where she turned back toward Mrs. Hale and the failing shop, while Nathaniel honored the boundary by leaving her there to make the next choice herself. The Tremont Street rooms were gone before Hannah had finished deciding how much she would miss them, and most of Mrs. Hale's best clients disappeared almost as quickly. By the time the surviving work had been moved into 2 rented rooms on South Street, Hannah understood that endurance alone would not rebuild what Edward's pressure had damaged. She and Mrs. Hale would have to create something that could survive without allowing another person's money or name to claim what the rebuilding meant. The South Street rooms were cramped. The afternoon light failed early, and there was barely space for 2 fittings at once. Yet Mrs. Hale insisted that the ledgers remain locked in their own cabinet as though nothing essential had changed. Nathaniel came only when they specifically requested help concerning the lease dispute or another legal question, and Hannah noticed that he never again offered to buy property, assume a debt, or place the Mercer name anywhere near their work. He could have solved several practical difficulties in a single afternoon, and both of them knew it, but he had learned that money could damage credibility when it arrived, carrying too much power. During one visit, he remained near the doorway and said, "Barrett has an answer about the old lease if Mrs. Hale wants it. If she does not, I will leave the matter alone." Hannah thanked him and watched him accept that limited role without resentment. Her affection deepened precisely because of his restraint, which made the feeling more frightening rather than less. If she ever married Nathaniel Mercer, people who had never seen her bent over a cutting table might decide that every room she opened, every employee she trained, and every client she earned had been purchased for her. The possibility angered Hannah because she knew Nathaniel himself would never make that claim. Yet Boston society might make it on his behalf. When business slowed enough that Mrs. Hale worried aloud about whether they could continue, Nathaniel did not offer rescue disguised as romance. Instead, he asked Hannah, "What do you need from me that will not make matters worse?" She could not remember another wealthy man asking a working woman such a question as though her answer truly controlled the limits of his generosity. "For now, nothing beyond Barrett's advice," Hannah said. Nathaniel accepted that, although concern remained visible in his face, and Hannah realized that his fear of losing her had become almost as real as her fear of depending on him. The difference was that he refused to turn fear into pressure. He never suggested that marriage would solve what South Street could not. The change came after Clara gained full control of an inheritance that belonged independently to her and offered capital to rebuild the dressmaking house. The proposed arrangement was unlike anything Hannah had expected. Clara's money would supply the foundation, but Mrs. Hale and Hannah would keep the business name, direct the work, preserve its reputation, and retain its profits. Clara's involvement would remain private rather than becoming a charitable performance attached to the Whitmore name. Hannah read the terms repeatedly before accepting them. She said yes, because Clara was offering resources without purchasing authority over the women who would use them. And because the arrangement preserved the lesson Hannah had been struggling to learn, help did not have to mean ownership. When Hannah told Nathaniel, he did not ask why Clara had chosen to help, or whether the decision revealed anything about what had happened in Newport. He simply said, "If those are the terms you and Mrs. Hale want, then I am glad you have them." Hannah searched his face. "You do not mind being outside it?" Nathaniel's expression softened. "I would mind very much if being inside it meant the business stopped belonging to you." The answer left Hannah unable to pretend that what she felt for him was gratitude, admiration, or any other feeling safely temporary. She loved him, and the recognition arrived with surprising calm before fear followed. Nathaniel's conduct had answered the question of whether he personally could respect her independence. What remained was whether marriage to one of Boston's wealthiest men would cause the world to erase the authorship of everything Hannah had built before him. As plans for Hale and Porter began replacing the makeshift arrangements on South Street, Nathaniel visited less from necessity and more because Hannah and Mrs. Hale welcomed him. Their conversations wandered beyond the crisis for the first time, yet he never treated increased closeness as permission to assume more. One evening, Hannah found him studying the new business name written across the top of a paper on Mrs. Hale's table. Nathaniel said nothing about marriage, but when his gaze moved from Hale and Porter to Hannah, she understood that he had begun to imagine asking for a place in her future. Hannah did not look away. Instead, she placed the paper flat between them, and Nathaniel left his hands at his sides, while both silently acknowledged that any future they shared would have to leave those two names exactly where they were. By the spring of 1832, Hale and Porter was preparing to move into larger rooms on Washington Street, and Hannah should have been thinking only about cutting tables, fitting schedules, and the women she still needed to train. Instead, when Nathaniel came to see her one quiet afternoon, she knew from the care in his face that he had brought a question neither of them could treat as ordinary. He did not mention his wealth, the Mercer name, Clara's assistance, or anything Hannah might supposedly owe him. "I want to share my life with you," he said. "I am asking whether you want the same." Hannah loved him enough that the answer hurt before she gave it. She admitted that she did want a life with him, then forced herself to finish the truth. "But I cannot marry you now." Nathaniel remained still while Hannah explained that Hale and Porter had only just begun to stand securely. Clients came because they trusted Mrs. Hale's experience and Hannah's hands, and the Washington Street rooms would depend on Hannah to establish standards, supervise fittings, and train the women who might eventually carry the work without her. If she became Mrs. Nathaniel Mercer at that moment, Boston might stop seeing a professional dressmaker building a business and start seeing a wealthy man's wife amusing herself with a shop. Worse, the business itself could begin to lean toward Nathaniel simply because suppliers, customers, and employees assumed it should. "I will not leave what we fought to build in order to prove that I love you," Hannah said. Pain showed openly in Nathaniel's expression, but he did not bargain with her. He did not promise that she could keep working if only she accepted him, because both understood that permission from a husband was not what Hannah needed. "Then I am disappointed," he said carefully, "but your no is still yours." Hearing that brought Hannah grief mixed with admiration rather than relief. Nathaniel remained in her life afterward, without turning patience into a performance. He continued his own work, visited when invited, and never suggested that continued affection entitled him to a different answer. His restraint made Hannah love him more, which was precisely why the following year became harder. By 1833, Hale and Porter was stronger, But the business still relied heavily on Hannah's reputation and skill. Progress showed everywhere. Yet independence remained incomplete because younger fitters still called for Hannah whenever a difficult bodice would not sit correctly or a complicated alteration threatened a gown. When Nathaniel asked a second time, he did so with the same plainness as before. "Has anything changed enough for you to want to say yes?" Hannah wished he had asked whether she loved him, because that answer would have required no hesitation. Instead, she looked around the workroom at unfinished gowns, appointment books, and women still learning to trust their own hands. "Not enough," she said. Nathaniel's face went still in a way that told her the second refusal had landed more deeply than the first. "Then I will not ask you to pretend otherwise." Hannah wanted to reach for him, but she stopped, because comfort offered in the same breath as refusal could become another kind of confusion. "I'm afraid you will grow tired of waiting," she admitted. Nathaniel considered the words before answering. "I may grow tired. I may be hurt. I may even decide one day that I cannot keep hoping. But none of those things gives me a claim on your answer." His honesty frightened Hannah more than a romantic promise that he would wait forever. Nathaniel was not offering devotion as a chain, nor was he asking her to reward him for being decent. Their relationship changed after that second proposal because affection remained while certainty disappeared. Nathaniel had to live with the possibility that Hannah might always choose the work before marriage, while Hannah had to accept that respecting her freedom might someday require him to stop asking. Even so, he never punished her with silence, or made his disappointment her burden to repair. He continued his own life, and allowed Hannah to continue hers within the boundaries she had set. Months passed, and Hannah began training the younger women with greater purpose, not because marriage had become a prize waiting at the end of the task, but because a business dependent on one woman's hands was not truly secure. She taught them to keep the ledgers with the same discipline Mrs. Hale had taught her. Write what happened, record what interrupted the fitting, and never pretend to know what a client felt unless she chose to say it herself. One evening, after Hannah corrected a fitter's work, she stepped back and watched the younger woman solve the next adjustment without calling for help. Nearby, 3 others completed their own fittings while Mrs. Hale reviewed the books without summoning Hannah once. On the cutting table lay 4 sets of training notes in 4 different hands. Hannah touched the pages and understood that she was no longer merely teaching assistants to imitate her. She and Mrs. Hale were building a business that could stand without Hannah occupying the center of every room, and for the first time the practical reason behind her 2 refusals began to loosen without anyone taking it from her. By early 1834, Hannah could walk through Hale and Porter without being summoned every few minutes to correct another woman's hands, and the change unsettled her more than she expected. 4 skilled fitters now kept the ledgers properly, handled difficult alterations, and followed the rule Hannah had taught them from the beginning. Record what happened in a fitting, but never pretend to know what a client felt. Hannah could leave the Washington Street rooms for an afternoon and return to find appointments completed, measurements entered, and Mrs. Hale entirely calm. For nearly 2 years, she had told herself that marriage to Nathaniel was impossible because the business still depended on her presence. Now the practical barrier had begun to disappear, leaving a harder truth she could no longer hide behind. She wanted Nathaniel, but she wanted him only if choosing him did not require abandoning herself or allowing the world to rewrite the history of what she had built. When he came to Washington Street again, Mrs. Hale was reviewing accounts at the front table, and Hannah knew from Nathaniel's expression why he had chosen the shop rather than some private drawing room. He looked at the cutting tables, the shelves of ledgers, and the women working beyond the open doorway before turning to Hannah. "I have asked you twice," he said, "and you gave me an honest answer both times. I am asking again because I still want a life with you, and because I understand now that this place is not something I am asking you to leave behind. It is part of the woman I am asking to marry." Hannah felt those words more deeply than any promise of wealth or comfort could have reached. Nathaniel was not offering to absorb Hale and Porter into his life. He was acknowledging that any life with Hannah would have to make room for what she had built independently of him, Mrs. Hale, who had made a determined effort not to look interested, finally set down her pencil and remarked that Hannah had trained 4 women capable of carrying the house forward. Hannah turned immediately. "That is true, but the decision is still mine, Mrs." Hale's mouth twitched before she lowered her eyes to the accounts again. Nathaniel did not smile or use Mrs. Hale's approval as pressure. "Yes," he said. "It is yours, and I will wait for your answer." That agreement quieted the last defensive thought in Hannah's mind. Over 4 years, Nathaniel had been given repeated opportunities to use his position against her without calling it cruelty. He could have bought the Tremont Street lease after she refused his help, demanded Clara's confidence because he had been the abandoned bridegroom, paid Hannah's way to Newport after she chose to fund the journey herself, or turned 2 rejected proposals into evidence that she owed him for his patience. He had done none of those things. Even now, with Hale and Porter secure enough to continue without Hannah's constant presence, he would not let another person answer for her. "There are things I will keep that you may never know," Hannah said, thinking of Newport without naming it. Nathaniel understood. "I know." Hannah told him that the business would remain hers and Mrs. Hale's to direct, and Nathaniel agreed without qualification. "I will work because I choose to work," she added, "not because you permit it." Something softened in his face. "I would not know how to love you while asking you to stop being the person I love." Hannah could not answer immediately. She remembered the man crying behind St. Paul's, ashamed of being seen at his weakest, and the stranger who had asked permission before, asking for a truth that could damage her livelihood. She remembered each refusal he had accepted, and each boundary he had learned not merely to endure, but to respect. Her fear had never truly been that Nathaniel would forbid her work. It had been that marriage to him would swallow the evidence that she had built a life before choosing him. Now Hale and Porter could stand without her hands at every fitting, and Nathaniel had spent 4 years proving that his love did not require ownership. Hannah looked around the room once more, not for permission, but to assure herself that nothing she loved there needed to disappear. Then she faced Nathaniel. "Yes," she said, and this time there was no second sentence waiting to take the answer back. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly before looking at her again, but he did not reach for her until Hannah stepped toward him first and offered her hands. He took them carefully, allowing the distance between them to end by her choice, just as it had been preserved by her choice. Mrs. Hale made a pointed sound over the account book and announced that she still intended to finish her figures before anyone became sentimental in the workroom. Hannah laughed, but she did not release Nathaniel's hands. Saying yes had not closed Hale and Porter or completed her independent life. It had created a new task for both of them, which was to join 2 lives without allowing one to consume the other. On the table beside them, the day's fitting ledger remained open beneath 4 different women's handwriting. Hannah glanced at the business name across the top of the page, then looked at Nathaniel, and together they chose the wedding month without changing a single word of Hale and Porter. On a June morning in 1834, 4 years after Hannah Porter found Nathaniel Mercer weeping behind St. Paul's Church, she stood beside him by choice and became his wife. Nothing in the ceremony erased the woman who had helped build Hale and Porter, and nothing in Nathaniel's name gave him ownership of the life Hannah had made before she chose to share it with him. Marriage changed Hannah's place in Boston society immediately, but it did not change the sign on Washington Street. Hale and Porter remained Mrs. Hale's and Hannah's business, its direction and profits separate from Nathaniel's shipping interests, while the fitting ledgers stayed under the control of the women who created them. Nathaniel never asked to inspect those books, and Hannah never had to defend their privacy twice. The principle they had learned painfully through Clara became an ordinary rule of their marriage. Something could matter deeply to one of them without becoming that person's property. Clara remained independent in Newport and never married. The money she had placed quietly behind Hale and Porter helped the business survive long enough to become secure, and later she directed her fortune toward establishing a hospital for women according to her own judgment. Hannah kept every promise she had made in the Newport room, including the promise Nathaniel had once accepted, without knowing what lay behind it. Edward Whitmore was never prosecuted, and Hannah never softened that fact into justice simply because the rest of their lives became happier. There were times when she still thought about what the law had not done and what Clara had chosen not to ask it to do. Nathaniel understood enough to know that Clara's refusal of public action was not his to overturn, while Hannah understood that respecting another woman's agency sometimes meant accepting an ending that offered no satisfying punishment. Their own marriage was built through quieter choices repeated over years. Nathaniel asked before assuming, listened before solving, and learned that protection offered without permission could become another form of control, even when the intention behind it was loving. Hannah, in turn, stopped treating every offer of help as a threat to her independence, because Nathaniel had shown her that assistance could be given without a hidden claim attached. She continued working at Hale and Porter, trained women who later trained others, and remained responsible for the standards she and Mrs. Hale had fought to preserve. Being Mrs. Mercer never became an explanation for the shop's success, because Nathaniel took care not to make himself one. The fact mattered to Hannah more than any public declaration he could have offered. Years later, when the rawness of that first June morning had softened enough for them to speak about it without pain filling the room, Nathaniel sometimes returned to the question that had never entirely left him. What if you had taken the other door out of the church? Hannah always knew what he meant. She could still see the rain-darkened stones, his discarded hat, and the hand that had closed around her sleeve before either of them knew the other's name. You would have gotten up eventually, she told him. You would have gone home, and people would have told you for the rest of your life that Clara simply changed her mind. Nathaniel would ask what might have happened to Clara, and Hannah's answer never changed. Without someone who had been present during those fittings, Clara might have spent years wondering whether fear had distorted her own memory, with no witness able to tell her that what Hannah had seen had been real before the wedding failed. Then Nathaniel would ask about Hannah herself, and she would think of the young dressmaker who once believed silence was the only reliable way to keep everyone she loved safe. I would have gone back to work, Hannah told him, and I would have remembered her face for the rest of my life without ever saying why. That was the true distance Hannah had traveled, not from working woman to wealthy wife, but from believing that her voice endangered everyone, to understanding that using it carefully could protect another person without taking away that person's choices. Nathaniel's journey had been just as real. He had once believed that enough money, influence, and determination could solve any problem placed before him. Loving Hannah taught him that sometimes the most honorable act was to stand beside someone without taking the decision from her. Their marriage lasted because neither mistook devotion for ownership. Hannah had not been rescued from her work, and Nathaniel had not been rewarded with her because he behaved well. They chose each other only after each had learned how to leave the other fully free, and that freedom became something they practiced rather than merely promised. One evening, after Nathaniel asked again about the other church door, Hannah finished her answer and held out her hand across the space between their chairs. Nathaniel waited until she offered it fully, then took it, and together they rose and turned toward the life they had chosen without asking either person to become smaller. If Hannah and Nathaniel's story stayed with you, tell me which mattered more to you, the moment she first spoke the truth, or the moment he learned not to demand it. If you enjoy romances where love grows through respect, patience, and difficult choices, consider subscribing. Share the story with someone who believes a happy ending should never require a woman to become smaller. And wherever you are listening from, I hope you carry one thing with you. Love means more when the person beside you is still free to choose.